Welcome! I'm Johan Nilsson.
And I'm Lincoln Murphy. And this is Impact Weekly.
We're here to help you make your customers successful. Each week, we answer your most pressing customer success management questions by relying on our years of experience with companies around the world.
Let's get this going. Okay, so let's get going for this week's topic. I have a really good question. It's coming from a CSM who's responsible for onboarding. And the question here is that this CSM is struggling with customers not being really prepared when they start onboarding. And this person is the struggle here is that they get a lot of work. They feel like sometimes they feel like sales is cutting corners and it's becoming their headache, and they think that the sales maybe should have done more in before even handing over the customer.
Right.
So I think this is a question we get a lot of times. And Lincoln, what do you say?
Yeah, I mean this kind of thing comes up a lot, unfortunately. I mean, I see this quite a bit, and I think there's a lot to unpack in this, what might seem like a relatively straightforward question, but there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, and I think, speaking of like cutting corners, I know sometimes that can be the case here, and been working in sales for a long time, I know I had seen sales reps doing a lot of things. Like I even had one sales rep that was selling a SaaS product to a customer that did not even understand it was a system or a digital tool. They thought it was just like a professional service they were getting. So this can happen, but and bad fit customers. That's a huge topic, so we'll probably get back to that. So let's just assume that this question is coming from a point where it's not a bad fit customer. Let's assume that. But still, I think when you're in customer success, we also have to realize that the sales process, there's a lot of things happening in a sales process, and there's a lot of things being covered. And sales, they will not go through everything that you might want to know in the onboarding phase. So we need to realize that as well.
For sure, and you're absolutely right. I mean, sometimes we will have a rogue salesperson out there doing crazy things that they shouldn't be. But I think so. When I'm working with a company, and this sort of thing comes up, or this is an issue that their CSMs are dealing with, what I will do is go back and listen to sales calls. So I listen to way too many sales calls for my own health, I think. But I will, and just to be clear, I will listen to calls that are taking place in, let's say, the last 25% of the sales cycle, because that's sort of how salespeople will look at things. And of course, it depends on the complexity of the sales cycle. But they'll say this: we're like 75% chance of these customers or these prospects becoming customers, whatever. So, listening to things in the latter part of the sales cycle, certainly going to listen to the last call that they have with a customer, going to listen to, a handover call if there is one between the salesperson and the customer success manager or onboarding specialist or whoever's sort of taking over post-sale. So I'll go back and listen to those calls if this comes up a lot, because I want to know, is the salesperson out there doing evil things, or is it something else? And I have to admit that I have gone into these calls before, or into listening to these calls with the idea that it's probably the salesperson doing something nefarious, something evil. Because I, as much as I like to talk about, we shouldn't have this us versus them mentality of customer success versus sales. I mean, I still fall into that trap all these years later. But I am very often completely shocked to find out who the culprit is in these situations. Again, yes, there are going to be the odd time where this is a salesperson, but very often what happens is in those latter stage of the sales cycle calls, the salesperson is bringing up with the customer what they're going to have to do to get started once the sale closes. They may not refer to it in that way, but they're kind of laying out, maybe just at a high level, but they're still laying out, this is what's going to happen in the first 30, 60, 90 days as a customer. Yeah. They might talk about things from a change management standpoint that the customer's going to have to do. They might bring up, and often do, that there's going to be work to do, right? It's so what happened, it's really interesting because they're like, okay, these conversations are taking place, but the customer is coming in as if those conversations didn't happen. So what's going on there? Yeah. Right. And I think what happens is you have to understand that this isn't the salesperson's fault. It's actually the customer in a lot of cases. And it's not that the customer is to blame. I'm not saying that the customer is doing anything wrong. It's actually kind of just human nature. Right. They're so excited, and even in a boring B2B, enterprise sale, they're still excited about buying something. Really what they're excited about is they're having their goal met, or whatever the thing is that they're buying, whatever it's going to accomplish for them. So they're excited. So when the salesperson says these things, they say, and you've heard this, they say, "Oh yeah, no problem. Got it. We're good to go." Right? And
exactly.
then they come into onboarding as if they've never heard these things at all before in their life. And I think what happens is it's just human nature. They heard, but they didn't really hear. They didn't understand. And now they're coming into onboarding as just without having, this idea of all the work they're going to have to do really setting into them. And so now they're confused and surprised by the work that they're going to have to do. So that's what I see a lot. It's not evil salespeople. It's usually the customer either misunderstanding or just not hearing.
Exactly. And I think this is why it's also really common this scenario, this phenomenon. And sometimes I think it's also like if there's been a long sales process, the customer like almost feels like they've done the job now by deciding to buy your product. That was the big job here, and they are almost exhausted about only doing their sales process. So,
wow, yeah. So the when they buy, that's the finish line, right, rather than the starting line. And I think that is a place where salespeople can sometimes, because for the salesperson, it kind of is the finish line. So the whole energy around that might be that, but really we need to make sure that it's being positioned for the customer as, well, you're actually just now after this, 3-month sales cycle, you're just now walking up to the starting line.
Yeah, I think that's one of the sides to this question. Another side, I think, is also, I've seen this sometimes, that especially if you're very technical, complex, product oriented in your onboarding, if you go in with the approach that the customer should have all the answers to your setup, that's also a way that you might feel that the customer is not prepared, because that level of detail maybe has not been covered in the sales process at all, or it's been only touched on briefly. So we also need to check ourselves as customer success managers that we cannot expect to have everything served for us when we start onboarding, just to make sure that we cover that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a really important point there. Even if the salesperson is doing this and the customer hears it, so the salesperson is teeing up what's going to have to happen, and the customer really does take to heart what the salesperson says, and they do start preparing, the likelihood of the salesperson going into the level of detail that would be necessary to be fully prepared, that is pretty low, and I think we shouldn't rely on the salesperson to do that. So one of the things that I see that can really help there is if the salesperson or perhaps they bring the CSM in, or there's somebody else, even a sales engineer or something like that, who could follow up with the customer after that conversation has taken place between the salesperson and the prospect. They could actually follow up with the prospect. We're talking about them before they've become a customer at this point, to say, here is a more detailed 30, 60, 90-day plan. So the follow-up to the conversation the salesperson has is, some sort of document that kind of goes into more detail. So we can't rely on the salesperson to have that really detailed conversation, but we can give them maybe a tool. We can talk about that more, a little bit later. But I think that's something that follow-up doesn't happen, and so it doesn't reinforce the conversation that the salesperson has had with the customer.
Yeah, I think that's. I think it's sometimes even as a customer success manager, onboarding maybe not your only part, the only thing you do. So what you mentioned there, to look at the onboarding process and almost like, okay, if I'm going to own this process, what needs to happen after, or even maybe even before the close, or even sales closing the deal. What do I need if I'm going to take full responsibility and ownership here? What should I do? I think it's a good way to look at this.
For sure, and I think so. One of the things we cover so we do this training for heads of customer success, and one of the things that we cover in there is capacity planning. And what's really interesting is what you just said. CSMs are not only doing onboarding; they're doing everything else with all of their customers across all the other lifecycle stages. And so a lot of times, CSMs are doing a lot of onboarding and also trying to do everything else with their customers. And this is where you really need to look at, if you're a head of customer success listening to this, you need to look at capacity planning. That's something we cover in our training, but regardless, you need to just understand, what does it really take for my CSM to be able to provide an appropriate experience for our customers at every stage of the life cycle. And if they're bogged down with too much onboarding, that may be a place where you want to kind of carve that out into, its own specific role, like an onboarding specialist or something. But, just there's a lot of those things at play too, right? So time and resources and energy come into play there. But, one thing I also wanted to make sure that we think about here is, like, why does it seem like the customer, when they come in unprepared as they are, why does it seem even worse than it should be? Like, they'll kind of have a bad attitude. They'll seem really shocked. It's kind of like, wow, okay, so they instead of just being like, okay, that's cool, let's work through this, they'll be like, oh, I didn't know I had this. I didn't know I had to do anything. That's not what I signed up for, right? They'll almost have, in some cases, hopefully not all, but we've all been there, where a customer actually seems to be put off in a, have a really negative reaction to this. And I think it comes down to those three things that customers hate. And I use the word hate purposely here, because it's such a visceral reaction that people have to things. There's three things that customers hate. That's surprises, unknowns, and repeating themselves. And if you look at this process, the handoff from sales to whoever's taking over immediately post-sale for the onboarding process, if they didn't expect this, you are invoking sort of both the unknowns and the surprises aspect to this. And then oftentimes, and this doesn't have anything to do necessarily with sales, not sort of letting them know what was going to happen and preparing them appropriately and them not hearing. But oftentimes you sort of stack on top of this the fact that a lot of handoffs are not super smooth, and you end up with a situation where the customer has to repeat themselves. They're going to tell the onboarding person, they're going to tell the customer success manager who's doing the onboarding, they're going to tell them the same things they already told the salespeople. So, now they're repeating themselves on top of being surprised that they're going to have to do all this work and having, these unknowns of like what what the first 30, 60, 90 days are actually going to look like for them. So you stack all of those sort of negative psychological triggers, and things become negative really quick. So there's a lot going on there. Like I said at the top, right?
That's a dangerous cocktail, right?
It really is, and it's just a bad way to start what should be and hopefully will be a really long-term relationship. So we need to figure out how to make this better, how to make this work, and I think we can.
Yeah, and let's look into that now. So we talked about this 30, 60, 90-day plan. Where do you start there? What's a good way to where to begin, basically?
Right. Well, this is one of those things that I think we can definitely overthink. We have just open a Google Doc and start writing down everything that a customer has to do on their own outside of the product, on their own inside of the product, things that you will do with them, things that you will do for them. If there's a professional services aspect or something, right? Just list all of the things in those 4 categories that have to happen in the first 30, 60, and 90 days. It's really that simple. Now, I always say you don't want to overwhelm, right? And of course, the more complex everything is, the more complex. If you have a really big system that your customer is basically going to run their business on, then you will necessarily have to, but also it may be expected to go into more detail because they're going to have a whole team on their side working this. Change management aspect is going to be really important. And if it's something that's not as complex, it's just not going to be as robust of a document. But no matter what, I say go into some detail on the first 30 days. And kind of do some high level stuff in this initial document on the next 60 days. You don't want to overwhelm. I just want to let them know, in some detail what the first month is going to look like. And the second and third month, I can roll those out to them in more detail as we go. I do want to have them have some idea of what to expect over those 90 days. But certainly the first 30 days, I want to break out in some detail. But just lay that out, and of course you can take it and make it look, really professional and all of that. But start with a document and lay these things out. And by the way, if you haven't done this, you're not alone. This is one of those things that a lot of companies, a lot of people, a lot of heads of customer success have not done for their teams. A lot of CSMs have not done this, or don't have access to this. That's not something to be proud of. That's not, just because that's kind of unfortunately still, I would say the majority, that's not a good thing. Yeah. We need to know these. How can you really help your customer if you don't know in detail what has to happen, especially those things that have to happen sort of out of your purview, out of your control, those things that they have to do on their own. And in onboarding, in the initial phases, there's a lot of stuff that they're probably going to have to do just to prepare to start using your product, right? They're going to have to document processes. They're going to have to gather data, all of those things that you don't have visibility or control over, visibility into or control over. And so you're going to have to, kind of rely on them to really do these things. So listing those things out is really important. So you can at least have a checklist for them so that you can go back to them and say, hey, where are you at with these things?
The best time to do this is, of course, when you're just in the middle or finishing an onboarding, because then you have it very clearly. And especially if you have struggled as this CSM that's asked the question here, if you had a few of those experiences, I think you should be able to pinpoint a few things that you really need in this plan. Because I think this is very operational, and you need to be looking at the details here to really make this work.
Oh, for sure. And we do need to be cognizant of the fact that anybody listening to this who's working in customer success exists in reality. And like you said, I think it's a really important point. Like this isn't the only thing you're going to be working on. So the best thing to do is, while you are working with your customers, just be documenting the things that you're doing, the things that they're doing, the things that they need to do. So, you're not going to necessarily sit down and spend, multiple hours working on this project, because that's just not reality. But while you're working with your customers, keep track of things so that, let's say over the next week, you could have this pretty well documented if you just started today. So, it doesn't have to be something you sit down and complete in one sitting. It doesn't have to be something you dedicate multiple hours to at a time. It's just something that you can start keeping track of as you go. And don't let perfection, get in the way of progress. So just start documenting this. At the very least, it's going to help you, if nothing else. But it's also going to be something that you can eventually, and hopefully sooner rather than later, put together and actually start sharing with your customers, and maybe even sharing with the salespeople that you work with, to have them provide that to their prospects after they have had that conversation. So this could be the follow-up to that.
Could even add value in the sales process.
Absolutely. It's in sales, there's this concept of a presumptive close, which is where you start acting as if the prospect has already bought, right? They've already agreed. So you start setting things up, you start talking about things as if they're already a customer. And so when, they could actually use this 30, 60, 90-day plan as part of that presumptive close. Like, here's what's going to happen when you become a customer. Here's what's going to happen as soon as you sign up. So that can really it can really help the salesperson. And I'll tell you what, if you help the salesperson close a deal, you're now their best friend. So that can only be a good thing.
Yeah. Great. So I think this 30, 60, 90-day plan is really crucial to fix your problem here with onboarding. Just a side point here is that it's also one of the issues when you have a really detailed plan is also to keep the customer really engaged and keep the energy up in the project, because especially if there is a complex setup, you don't want to lose momentum in that one. There's a lot around that. I think we might even come back to that, right, Lincoln?
Yeah, I think there's a whole. We could probably do a series of episodes on that. But I think that's something we need to tackle on its own. But you're absolutely right. I mean, keeping customers engaged during onboarding is really a challenge, because this is probably of all the sort of life cycle stages, this is the one that's almost entirely focused on the functional and technical aspects of using the product. You're not going to achieve your goal in onboarding, right? As a customer, you're not going to get real value out of this lifecycle stage. This lifecycle stage is all about setting you up to get value. So yeah, I think there's a lot there. We'll tackle that in an upcoming episode for sure.
All right. So getting back to this question now. So how do we move from a situation where you feel that you have a customer coming into onboarding unprepared into making it work smoother? If we let's summarize this for this CSM in three actionable things that they could do today or at least this week.
Yeah. So I think, okay, so if we just said, how do we do this? Like I alluded to this earlier, I think the first thing you have to do is start putting together this plan. So like I said earlier, you take essentially 4 categories of things that your customers will need to do, things that they do on their own outside of your product. So that's things that you don't have control over and you don't really even have visibility into, things that they have to do on their own outside of the product, things that they have to do inside of your product. So, things that they're going to do inside of your app, but they're going to do those on their own. You will have some visibility into that, of course, depending upon your situation, but you're not going to be doing that with them. But then there's also things that you will be doing with them. So, on a screen share or something like that, you'll be doing in a Zoom session or whatever. And then there's things that you would do for them. Maybe that's things that your professional services team or whatever would do. Yeah. But you kind of figure out those 4 categories, all the things that they have to do. So start documenting those. And so the thing to do today, like I said, open a Google Doc or whatever you take notes in, and just start documenting those 4 categories of things right now. So start there. And something to keep in mind, though, it's really important, is this may differ across your different customer segments. Usually there's going to be some overlap. They're going to share, 80% of the steps, the things that they have to do. But, there may be enough differences between whatever your logical customer segments are that you may have a couple of different versions of this. So just keep that in mind. And then, so once you have that, and again, don't let perfection get in the way of actually making progress. So just this could be a sort of a working doc, but once you have it to a certain, a place where you feel like it's complete enough that a customer could get some value from it, this is something you could share with your salesperson, the salespeople that you generally work with. This is kind of, I'm going to be honest, this is maybe one of those places where you kind of have to ask for forgiveness after you've done this rather than asking for permission. But, you may want to go ahead and just share this with your salespeople. And then if somebody comes and asks what you're doing or why you did it, say, I'm sorry, it's my first day. I didn't realize that was bad. But this is one of those things where you look, here's the reality. As a customer success manager, you often have to advocate for yourself and for your customers. And you need to do things that are in your best interest and in your customer's best interest. And working through some of the, just the bureaucracy that might be in there, might take too much time and it might not be approved. But after the fact, if somebody says, what were you doing? You can just sort of say, well, I did this, and if you don't want me to do it again, that's fine. But it's already done, and now the salespeople have this, essentially really valuable asset that they can use as that presumptive close, but that is also going to help your customers come into the onboarding process much more prepared. So I don't think it's ever going to be seen as a bad thing. I've never seen it in any way seen as a bad thing, but just know that if you go directly to your salespeople without going through proper channels, somebody might say something, but in this case, you may want to just ask for forgiveness rather than permission, but you didn't hear that from me.
So create the plan. You can do that. Start today. Share it with the people you work with in sales, and then number 3, of course, you should also share this with the customer as part of your onboarding. I mean, even maybe sales have already shared some of it, so they should be familiar with it. But then you use it in your onboarding and share it with your customer. You can do that as a doc or a shared workspace or similar, and that will help you as well, and it will help you set the expectations for the customer, of course. So that's number 3. And actually, we have a bonus one that's you should also bring this to your attention to your if you're not the head of customer success yourself, bring it to your head of customer success, and I'm sure that there's a lot more that could be added to this and help the other people in the team as well. So those are the 3 very concrete things to do today based on this question. Hey, thanks for listening. Do you want to bring your customer success to the next level? Check out Impact Academy. We have training programs for customer success managers and for leaders in customer success.